Thank you. So the risks of using the data-driven approach as opposed to theory-driven approach is to find spurious patterns and think that they are actually entrenched in the data, but they can be incidental. So there are a number of precautions that we need to take. But it is essential that quantitative and qualitative approaches to be used together so that especially when you're working with computer scientists like me, we have a very data-driven approach. We can apply pattern recognition, machine learning. We have no idea what's going on with the actual people that are at the other end of the data. So that needs to be complemented. Otherwise, it's going to create weird things. There are a bunch of premises of the project. If I can go to the next slide. Yes. How do we harness new data sources for migration analysis and policymaking? How can we identify uncertainties and reappraise assumptions that are important in for particular data sets? Can we explore the reasons why migration predictions may not hold? Because we create these prediction models, but every unique situation brings a bunch of unique factors that are not in any model that is pre-trained. Conceptualizing hubs of migration, listening to migrants on the way to understand the root causes of migration. So that part is the qualitative part of the puzzle, and using big data as proxies for migration measures. Now we have a bunch of work packages and we address a wide range of data sources, but primarily satellite data, social media data, and mobile phone data. So I will talk a little bit about each of these work packages, showing you some small results. The first one is WP4 on satellite imaging. And in this work package, especially, we look at environmental migration movements. So you can see here the Somalia population map from 2010, the Somalia major rivers map, the land cover area map, and then the environmental migration map. In this work package, we look at different data sets, the Sentinel-1 and 2 data, NASA data, but then some additional indices computed from the satellite data, like the soil moisture index, which is an important factor in drought-related migration, standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, and then we also use some internal displacement data. The satellite data is typically processed to generate products, which can be, let's say, which are at a higher level of interpretation or semantics, and they can be used as indices. And you can see here, for example, a drought map in Somalia using data from August 2017. And the products that we use here are vegetation spectral indices, drought indicators, flood maps, and land cover change maps. So change detection is one of the major paradigms in analyzing this kind of data. Some of the key findings in this work package are that slow onset climate events like droughts and rapid onset climate events like earthquakes and floods, they have different impacts on society and the response on the mobility. And the impact of floods is mostly localized, limited to some districts. A lot of migrants for major floods, they will try to stay close to their home, but just outside the direct disaster zone. This is a pattern actually we also see in the earthquake, where people try to stay close to the area if they can, because they have their loved one under the rubbles, or they have some wealth under the rubble. They don't want to leave the cities that they're born and raised there. But when push comes to shove, you will see that people will start moving. Drought has a more progressive impact. People start to leave their homes with some delay, and then it takes much longer to return home. Compared to regular floods that are just a part of the agricultural cycles, and it's important, especially in some areas, for the growth season, where the local plant cover is adapted to that kind of drought. Extreme floods are more likely to be destructive and lead to migration. Now, the second important source that we deal with is the social media. And when we say social media, of course, it's not just a single source, but there are many different social networks, online social networking sites from which we can pull data. We use Twitter a lot, but as you may know, the Twitter API is now a bit more restricted, with Elon Musk toying with different revenue models of Twitter. So it may become more and more difficult to work with this kind of data. But even in the past, Twitter API has changed many times. So each time it changes something, of course, you need to take this account in your analysis, because your analysis may fluctuate, not because the data is changing, but because the algorithms of accumulation of the data is changing. So biases, technological biases, play a big role in analyzing the social media data. For Facebook, the social connectivity index has been very important in nowcasting models, because it shows you what kind of diaspora you have for a particular location. So if I look at one country and I look at where it is connected to, then if something is happening at that country, I have a notion of where people might go. Now we're discussing with Umberto whether we can apply this to the earthquake in Turkey, where we think about maybe a local diaspora, where we look at this at the city level. Okay, an earthquake in Istanbul, where will people go? Can we use social connectivity to estimate the local diaspora and thereby predict the people's mobility in an earthquake? For social integration, Twitter offers interesting insights, because you also have the text and you can analyze the text for example, positive and negative sentiments, both from the texts generated by the migrants and by the natives, by the locals. So you can look at the origin and destination attachment. You can also look at sentiment and hate speech towards migration. We actually have a project, a European RIA project starting called RAISE, that will look at xenophobia, racial and ethnical hate speech towards minorities, using social media among many other and qualitative indicators. Mobile phones provide also a wealth of data, but they are more difficult to access than social media in general. If in the past people have used different aspects of mobile phones, one of them is call detail records, and that's every time you make a phone call, the base tower location of your phone and the connected phone are entered into a table in the mobile telecom operator, and with that you can actually guess how many people are making phone calls at a particular area in the city. So that means you can actually estimate the people, and you can also track individual phones to estimate flows, but then you have to kind of do this in an anonymized, aggregated way. And maybe Stefano will tell you that there are a lot of risks associated with this kind of tracking. So you have to be really careful that individuals should not be trackable with this kind of analysis. Extended detail records are at the moment what we work with in the HumMingBird project. These are every time your phone is exchanging a data package. Now, that doesn't help us to see something like a social connectivity, because I don't know whether you're calling, Mechelen or Amsterdam, but I know where you are. So I can do some stuff with it. And we also look at a breakdown of data in terms of different subpopulations like Syrians, Afghans, and Turks. Then we have inbound roaming and outbound roaming data. That's when you cross borders, because this kind of data is only good for within a country. When you cross borders, if you still use the same phone line, then we can look at the roaming data, but that's usually expensive. So not many people do that. And then there is a final data set that we are using within this project. It's airtime top-up transactions, and that's a very novel data source. We're looking into its potential. That's what happens when you send mobile credits to your parents in your native country, for example. And this is a business-to-business model, and we get the data directly in a very aggregated way from the company that facilitates this. So here, for example, you can see where the top-up outflows are going from Italy to Cameroon on the right-hand side, and on the left you can on the left you see the airtime top-up flow. On the right, you see the official statistics of Cameroonian migrants living in Italy. So, for example, the official statistics show no people, no Cameroonians in Sicily, whereas our airtime top-up transfer suggests strongly that there are Cameroonians also in Sicily. Another nice thing about this kind of data is you can do this at a daily or weekly or a monthly basis, and it's very timely. We combine satellite data with mobile phone data, and we create maps of where the migrant populations are roughly distributed in the country. And those kind of analysis you can use for optimizing resources. For example, the Turkish Red Crescent used this kind of data to optimize the mobile health centers created for the Syrian refugees. And you can also generate origin destination matrices. This is an earlier work based on the data for refugees data set that we have published in 2018. That's the agricultural seasonal work. So refugees are coming to Ordu for hazelnut harvest. Where do they come from? How long will they stay? These things you can actually see in the mobile data. For other sources of data, of course, interesting data for skilled migration you can get from LinkedIn and Crunchbase. LinkedIn, I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Crunchbase is more familiar to people who are thinking about creating startups. It's a big database of all the small companies and startups and evaluations of them. So if you want to get some funding through VCs, that's an important database. But it's very rich data. It's very up-to-date data, but it's difficult to obtain. So you have to find ways of working with this kind of data. In a new publication, Alina and colleagues looked at air traffic data to find general mobility trends, and they also investigated what happened after Brexit. And can we detect trends using this kind of data? Combining data sources is sometimes very difficult because they come at different granularities and from different time spans. So you have to do a lot of generalizations, and it's very difficult in the absence of ground truths how these generalizations affect your analysis. So we looked at, for example, sometimes in the HumMingBird project, there were events that prompted us to take action. So we did some analysis that were not planned before. When in March 2020, Erdogan opened the borders to Europe, for example, after attacks in Idlib in Syria, we said, okay, we can actually use the mobile phone data and the Twitter data to see who is going to the border, who is coming back, who is disappearing from the data, and what is the demographics, right? So we can actually see and predict, or no, not predict, estimate how many people crossed into Europe, and the numbers are vastly lower than what Erdogan was claiming to be. And what kind of demographics? They were not Syrians, maybe most of them were of Turkish origin. So if you know the political situation in Turkey, you can interpret these kind of findings. For combining satellite data with mobile phone data, we look at both stocks and flows. Of course, mobile phone data can give you some interesting flow information that's very difficult to detect in flows. Yesterday, in the Miram workshop, Ingmar Weber showed us a very nice recent work where they use the satellite information to count the number of cars in a city. And with that, they can do some stock prediction. But what they cannot do is they cannot predict flows with that because they cannot connect the car mobility. But mobile phone data can actually give us that. A bunch of ethical and legal issues that we constantly deal with and constantly monitor our projects for violations and for breaches. Social media can become small data when you're focusing on migrants. So when we looked at the border rush, we looked at Turkish-speaking people on the Greek side of the border and Greek-speaking people on the Turkish side of the border, but then the numbers are very small. So then there is additional risk associated with working with small data. You have to make sure that there is no risk of re-identification, and you need to minimize data and aggregate to smaller group. One thing that we frequently use in this project is to process the data with, let's say, at least a 6-month time gap so that these people are not endangered. But in an actual situation, we're promising real-time or near real-time benefits, then you have to take extra precautions. And also legal and practical accessibility of data sources may change over time. For example, when we wrote the HumMingBird project, we said we're going to get the base tower locations from Turkcell, and we're going to use it to estimate the migrant numbers around the base tower locations. But the legal regulations changed, And base tower locations are now considered to be sensitive military information, because you can now stage a drone attack and take out all the base stations at the same time, crippling the communication infrastructure of a country. So we couldn't get the base tower locations. Then we had to do some additional assumptions, maybe add some noise to the actual locations, but that of course affect a little bit the analysis. One of the nice outcomes of the project was a book that we have edited with many contributions from the HumMingBird project and from sister projects, Data Science for Migration and Mobility. And this was written from both perspectives, both computational social scientists and social scientists contributed to this book. And if you go to the QR code, you will find all the deliverables and publications that we have in the HumMingBird project in a single portal. I will stop here. I don't know whether I'm over time or not. But...
No, all good.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So now to the floor, maybe I could take this. We ask Dilek and Arkadiusz to join from FUME, and I can fix this. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dilek Yildiz from IIASA, and I'm going to present with Arek the traditional and new data sources. So of course, when you present traditional data sources in a conference like this, there is a risk of people mentioning the shortcomings beforehand. This is exactly what happened to me. So I will try to be very brief. I will show you a few additional graphs that confirms the traditional data sources also need improvement. So we know that unlike births and deaths, migration happens multiple times in a lifetime, and it's difficult to measure when someone leaves a country than when someone enters a country on the destination side. Good migration data are available, especially in Europe, but they are mostly located in the Okay, they are especially located in rich and Western countries. When we have the data, we have inconsistent definitions and collection methods leading to inconsistent number of migrants, and these are prohibiting cross-national comparisons. So with traditional data, meaning talking about censuses and registers mainly, we can get to really small areas and learn a lot about the socio-demographic characteristics of resident population, including migrants. However, they are, as we know, not up to date. We had recently the 2020 census round all over the world, but they are always often in every 10 years. And the most recent Eurostat data I'm going to show you later refers to the 1st of January 2021. So there is a quite big of lag. And then we have the inconsistencies in reported numbers when we measure the same thing with two data sources or from two sides of the migration corridor. This might be due to different definitions. We saw that some countries collect data on country of birth, some collect country of citizenship. In Eurostat, we have both, so we can have a look how these two relate to each other. And unfortunately, the relationship is not linear in all countries. Here we see, for example, on the left side, the Afghan and Syrian migrant stocks in Austria, where there was an increase, as we know, and then the country of birth and the country of citizenship definitions give us almost the same number. Of course, we are talking about the aggregate level migrants here. But if we look at Turkish and Polish migrants living in Austria, we see a difference between country of birth and country of citizenship. Because these people have been living in Austria for a long time, they integrated, they gained the citizenship and so on. So we have to be kind of careful not to compare apples and pears. Sorry. So another thing is when we look at the traditional data and the definitions is the duration of stay. The criteria for migrants are different across different countries. And of course, we have the difficulties in measuring immigration. So with Guy Abel, we looked at these differences in Eurostat data in this paper. We looked at immigration and immigration flows in EU countries. And you may know or not know, in 2007, the European Parliament implemented a regulation to harmonize international migration data. So which means now we should have improved migration data within EU. And in an ideal, perfect data situation, we should have the number of immigrants reported from country A residing in country B should match the number of immigrants living country A to reside in country B, which means that all those circles would have been in the 45% line. So on the left side, we see the data compared prior to 2007, and on the right side, we see after 2007. And we see a lot of more variation before the regulation. And after the regulation, the variations still exist, but the lighter colors shows the time passed after the regulation. So the yellowish colors are most recent data. So we see a lot of improvement now, the immigration and immigration statistics, at least within Europe, starting to agree more to each other. And the last thing I'm going to show is that also we heard about this LFS surveys quite often. They are very good and very good sources providing lots of data almost globally, but they have different sampling frames. And then in the sampling frames, not always all the migrants have the probabilities to be selected in the sample. So it's not so easy to just compare LFS numbers between countries, or sometimes even over time, they change the sampling frames. And finally, if you look at registers, there are, of course, different registers have different aims and they have different population of interests. So here we see one of our case study cities, Krakow, and different colors show us estimates of number of foreigners in Krakow by different registers. So we see 3 different stories here, ranging from in 2020 to 24.2 thousand people to 57.5 thousand people. And if you look at the rightmost, the red number, this is the results from the census 2021. So just, I wanted to say that be cautious about traditional data, and I know you already know it. So Arek can explain to you how we use this data in connection with the new data sources.
Thank you, Dilek. Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. This is a really nice graph. I just going to mention very briefly why we are so interested in the social media or new forms of data, new types of data. As of 2022, according to the International Telecommunications Union, about 95% of the world population, 7.5 billion people, have been covered by the 3G mobile network. About 87% had an active mobile broadband subscriptions, 66% used internet, and about 60% of the world population were social media users. So that shows that we are reaching to this data because they are quite ubiquitous. Of course, there are differences between countries. There are lower income countries, for example, this internet usage is about 36%. Still, it's quite a large number in terms of the total population. So I focus here on the digital trace data left in the social media data and just give you 2 very brief examples because the time is short, and I refer you to the further reading and our deliverables from the FUME project. The social media data and other media, as we can see in the presentation, the first presentation by Albert, they have quite lots of potential estimating migration mobility. There are various reviews about that. The main advantages, again, I'm repeating now previous speakers, they are publicly available, they are timely, which which is what Rainer mentioned. There's no story, no interesting story if the data are 2 years or 18 months delayed. Very often they are geotagged, so you can have this location, even though it can be suppressed because of the security reasons. The main limitation is, well, representativeness, which causes bias. And representativeness is about not everyone using social media or not everyone having access to internet, and also not everyone being genuine in the usage. So it can be bots, it can be institutional accounts, it can be just not providing genuine information. So first example that what we've covered in the project in the work package for FUME, and that is a work. This has been submitted with journal, but it will be available in deliverable 4.1. We try to estimate stocks or nowcast migrant stocks in the EU with multiple sources of data. So that's one of our approaches. That's one of the conclusions that we suggest, that we don't use this data alone. We use this data in integrated with other data sources, because we know that, just to paraphrasing a famous saying from statistics, we know that all data are wrong, but some are useful. And so that's what we are using. So for example, here we have data in red. The red dots are officially reported to Eurostat data on stocks by country of birth. And we see the Netherlands have this data. UK do not provide such data, perhaps because they relied on a quite imperfect data source, the International Passenger Survey. This has changed because of the COVID pandemic, but nevertheless, we finished in 2019 data collection. Then we have Facebook data. These are the blue, sorry. These are the blue dots, and then we observe that there's an increased pattern, which is quite correlated with the reported data in Eurostat, and then there's this sudden jump downwards. Now, what is that? It's because Facebook changed their algorithm of how they calculate the number of people. So, caveat emptor, you need to really understand what's going on with the data and don't trust it at face value. So the label for survey data, which technically should measure the same things as here, but they do not. Same in the UK. So another point, which is referring to the previous session, is so here the data are country of birth, but Facebook is relying on a definition of lived in a country, which is estimated by their algorithm, which is a black box, by current city or hometown, which are self-declared by the users on Facebook and validated by using a connection, social network, and types of device. So now this is this vague definition of origin that we have heard in the previous session. The limitations, perhaps more technical ones, are that there's no retrospective collection. So we can have this timely information as of now. If I collect the data, I will have them now, but I will not have them for yesterday or for last year. So we need to keep collecting this data if we want to have a time trend and be aware of the situations when the algorithm changes. And there's also censoring. So of course, this is a marketing API, therefore they want us to believe that there is a decent population that can be reached with our marketing campaign, which is of course fake because this data is freely available. But there's this lower censoring, so the 1,000 population will be always reported for the small stocks. Another example is a paper that has been published in demographic research, which is a case study of migration from Romania to the United Kingdom. And it's based on Google Trends data. So Google Trends, it's freely available. It just reports and why Google Trends? Because it's used about 93% of the market share globally is Google Trends. I even checked whether Baidu in China is popular, but apparently it's not that popular. It's only a small percentage of the market share globally. And it provides, the data provides interest in given search word that you can specify for a given country and for a given language, sometimes even area, and it's scaled from between 0 and 100. And what we've done here in this study is we just use a lexical approach where we use some hypernyms or kind of mother words like employment, education, housing, currency, and the synsets of all possible sets of synonyms with prepositions, etc., and we check. And we just collected all this information and created some indices that reflected this for hyperlinks, so currency, education, employment, and housing. So here we see the data. So these are these indices in these dashed lines, and sorry, these are the raw data, and then there are the aggregate indices. So for example, how they align with migration, observed migration from Romania to the UK. Perhaps the education one was the mostly highly correlated, and that what kind of showed later on, it actually did contribute to the reduction of forecast errors when we wanted to nowcast migration, sudden changes in migration, such as, for example, from 2017 to 2018, there was a sudden decrease, perhaps because of the Brexit referendum in the UK. And that indeed helped to predict migration. However, this Google Translate data, they don't measure migration, they capture behaviors or intentions. And now there's a question, how long in advance do you search for about movements, whether your intentions realize, and so on. So this is not a data set that can be used alone, it can be used in combination with other data sources. So there's not a perfect data source. Traditional data sources, as Dilek and others explained earlier, one of the problems is they are not up to date, and there are sizable differences in reported numbers. The new types of data have big advantage in terms of availability. They are available now. They are available in principle, often freely, not mobile phone data, but for example, social media data. They are granular, so they often have these characteristics that we lack in official or traditional data sources, and they may capture behaviors of people, sometimes not genuine, but we believe that some of them are indeed genuine. The limitations are, again, biases due to representativeness, the black box nature, missingness, or sometimes the access problems, such as the changes in ownership of Twitter may indeed impact lots of research that has been done using this source. So our approach to that would be to understand data and the context in which they are collected, and try to look at this migration process from different perspectives, perhaps not using one perfect data source, but multiple flawed data sources that show a different view of the same process. Thank you very much.
And now again, online, we have with us Jakub, who hopefully we also see him.
Yes. Hello.
So yes, word to you, and then we'll have a commentary session after your presentation.
Thank you very much, Vaida, and thanks again for this opportunity. I'd like to complement what has been said already in this session, being especially grateful to Dilek and Arek for setting the scene, because what I will going to say is actually quite strongly based on what they have been presenting. So I will be talking about the estimating of European migration flows based on mostly traditional data that we did in QuantMig for the past decade, 2009-2019. This is a presentation done on behalf of Peter, who unfortunately couldn't be here, and Georgios, who did most of the number crunching. But this is something that is strongly based in the work that was done before and was actually led by Arek in another project, in a project Integrated Modeling of European Migration, IMEM, which is where the methodology comes from. So I quickly mention that at the beginning, strengthening the case for Bayesian methods, a snippet of which you could see in the bottom right corner of Arek's last slide. And then we'll have a look at the modeling framework we applied in this case, a note about covariates and the results. So, as Dilek has said, we've got the situation where on the one hand, we need data on migration, and then as many other speakers, including Rainer in the opening remarks, said that the data are problematic in many ways, timeliness being one of them, but also the fact that they do not align with each other, that different sources that are meant to be measuring the same thing are painting a completely different picture of what's going on. Again, following up on Dilek, what we've got is differences in definitions, differences in data collection techniques, differences in features of migration sources. So the challenge becomes that we'd like to really harmonize these measurements to obtain some at least some coherent measures of migration flows with an explicit acknowledgement of measurement error, but at least something that would be taking everything and benchmarking it to a common definition, common conceptual framework. And just as an illustration of how bad the situation is, I'll get back to the improvements that were made after the regulation 862 came into force in a moment. But this is just a snapshot of what we could identify in Eurostat for 2009. So the first year in which the new regulation were meant to be in operation across the EU. So you can see that there are many missing items, that there are still discrepancies between the reported numbers. And North Macedonia is included because besides doing the core work for QuantMig, we also did a bit of a spin-off piece of work for North Macedonia, helping them understand their migration processes through the lens of statistics from other countries. So all in all, the picture is, as you would expect, many countries either do not have the data or do not report the data to Eurostat. The reports that are available differ, and they can differ by, even in the Macedonian case, by several orders of magnitude. And this situation requires a thoughtful approach to combining the information we've got in a common framework. And this is something where, this is the departure point. So the IMEM, the Integrated Model of European Migration project, which led by James Raymer, where AREC did most of the work back in the sort of early parts of the last decade. But what we've got is a framework that's actually proved very versatile, framework for putting together different data sources. We will use it for formal official statistics, but also this can be used for other data sources, and it has been productively used also for bringing in new data sources such as Facebook in Francesco Rampazzo's work. But the idea was to use a Bayesian statistical model to harmonize and correct the data as well as estimate the missing flows at the same time in a single integrated model. And the output of that would be a database of measures with the approximations of uncertainty or errors. And so what we've got is that we've got a model. The model there is a statistical model and nice theory underneath it. But at the same time, not all the elements of the model can be specified from the data. So the other component that we need is expert opinion, which needs to be specifically elicited in order to be implemented into the modeling process. And why Bayesian methods, right? Statisticians like uncertainty because, in a sense, the statistics is about uncertainty, and there's this idea that if we can measure, if you want to measure uncertainty, especially uncertainty coming from different sources, the best way of doing this is in a coherent probabilistic approach where we use probability to measure the uncertainty, and the Bayesian approach is a natural language for that. It offers us a way of combining the uncertainty in the data, in the parameters of the model, in the model itself, in expert judgment, including the degree to which the experts themselves are uncertain or disagree about things. So the aim of this work in QuantMig was actually to take the IMEM work, extend it. So IMEM estimates were available for 2002 to 2008. We extended for 11 more years, bringing this until 2019. And we have done the estimation for 32, as it were at the time, EU and EFTA countries. So for all practical purposes, the UK is treated as a EU or EU equivalent member in that period, because it's only since 2020 when the Brexit has become actually felt in the legal sphere. We benchmarked everything to the United Nations standard definition of a long-term migration, so 1 year duration of stay. And we also extended the IMEM approach not only to provide estimates by 5-year groups of age and by sex, but also by region of birth. So we distinguished EU and non-EU born migrants. This is something that you have already seen in Helga Valk's presentation before lunch, and some of it will also become of importance in Michaela Potonczakowa's talk after the coffee break. How the model works? We've got the model is, for those of you who don't know it, the model has 2 parts. It has a migration model for estimating the missing flows, a theory-based model, and it has a measurement model that tries to reconcile the different measurements of the same thing, so different measurements by the sending and by the receiving country, allowing for differences in definitions, i.e. duration criteria, in the accuracy of measurement, in the levels of undercount. So that's the schematic representation of the model. And in terms of covariates, what we did, we also used the IMEM approach as a base, but have updated both the covariate information as well as the information about the assessment of quality of official European data sources of migration. And this was an interesting exercise, because as Dilek was showing the empirical part of it in the work which they did with Guy Abel, to try to see the potential impact of the regulation 862 on the actual numbers that get reported. So that was the graph in which all the dots were supposed to move closer to the 45-degree line. We did the same, only from a sort of conceptual meta informational point of view, and the findings were interesting. So we found that there was indeed progress. So that corroborates the results that Dilek was presenting. There was indeed progress in terms of what definitions different countries were using. Most of them, except Slovakia, would be saying that they're using 12-month duration criteria for the period we looked at. But the flip side of that was that the gaps in reporting actually increased. So those countries that report data to Eurostat are more likely to do it on a common definitional basis. But then at the same time, some countries stopped reporting countries to Eurostat, and this notably includes Germany, which, given the prominent place of Germany in the European migration system, you can appreciate how big a gap this leaves. So we have done that, and we have come up with a classification of countries according to the accuracy, duration and undercount levels in the migration data that they report. So we have snapshots of that here, with some countries not reporting data or not reporting sufficient data to allow us this evaluation. So as you say, as I said, duration almost everywhere it's 12-month criterion. Now accuracy varies, undercount also varies. This information was additionally boosted by the insights we got from an expert elicitation exercise that was carried out to update the work we've done in the IMEM project before. But here is what comes out. So just a few snapshots. We've got all possible combinations of origin, destination, pairs of flows for migration within Europe, as well as migration into and out of 8 regions in the rest of the world. So here are just a few things. Italy to Spain or Estonia to Sweden. You can clearly see that the receiving country data, the blue lines, are largely driving the final estimates. So the final estimates with errors are the black lines, solid and dashed. The green lines, by the way, are the median estimates that would be observed from the migration model alone if there were no data available. So if we've got data from the receiving country, this is what will be largely driving the estimate, possibly with some undercount. That's why you see a shift there. But if at least one of the sources is missing, you can see how uncertainty increases. This is the example of Germany to Sweden, Germany to the UK, and especially Portugal to Germany when we didn't have any reports in the Eurostat collection. And likewise, so here is the big uncertainty is just the result of non-reporting of official statistics to Eurostat. Even though there are some countries, like Germany, has the data for internal purposes, the data are collected, but it's just that they are not openly shared. The final example, Italy to Latin America, there is, by definition, there is only one set of data. In this case, it's the sending country, Italian country, because Latin America is an aggregate and we do not have origin-specific destination-specific data for the rest of the world regions. But all in all, there is a database. So here is another example. The North Macedonian example contrasts one country with excellent accuracy and low undercount, which is Sweden, and one country with low accuracy and high undercount of migration, which is North Macedonia, sort of helping you appreciate the differences between the two and how much of the final estimates will be driven not only by the receiving country reported numbers, but also by the fact that the quality of data, register-based data in Sweden is so much better than in North Macedonia. Ditto for Germany, the Macedonian data do not play much of a role in those, but you can see that even though the German data are available, the final estimates actually follow the theory-based insights more closely than they do follow the Macedonian reports. So all in all, what we managed to achieve in this piece of work was to extend and modify the IMM model, update all the information and meta information, produce harmonized estimates for different European migration flows. An additional value added was actually that we started looking into regions of the rest of the world rather than treating the rest of the world as a single entity. And this proved quite important also for the scenarios that Michaela will be presenting 2 sessions down the line. And of course, we have a boilerplate model that is able of handling different data sources and integrating them in a coherent way, which produces estimates together with what we hope are coherent measures of uncertainty. And the final thing to note is that the full database is currently undergoing the final stages of testing and will be coming up probably next month on QuantMig.eu. So it will be a fully searchable database with all outputs from the QuantMig, from all the estimates from the QuantMig project, and we also hope to bring in the IMM collection into the mix, so that there is a resource, a tool for the research and user community to use in case they would like to make the best of these estimates that will soon become available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakub, and hope you can stay. You will have another presentation coming up, but now it's time to hear some comments from Damien and Jusselme, Global Migration Data Analysis Center in IIASA, and you can join, and we welcome also Arek and Dilek to join the table. Please use the microphones. Now they're red, so nobody will hear you, but if you push the button, it will turn green. And we have Jakub online. So yeah, let's hear your first reflections, Damien.
Thanks, and hi everyone. Thanks for the speakers as well for the insightful presentations. overall, I think I had a few points, I think, to react a little bit, which I believe are quite in line with also our own position in IOM with regard to innovative data. Like you, I think the UN is quite taken into this this kind of wave of discussions and work around like non-traditional innovative data sources and how we can leverage some of this for migration trends and stocks, and particularly also looking into prediction analysis. We've had actually an event last week in Brussels specifically on this. So yeah, I think it's quite a very trendy discussions, and the UN is definitely also very much taken into those discussions. With this, I think 3 points that I would make. Of course, the first one is around ethical consideration. I think everyone in the room knows the plethora of ethical concerns. You presented about it yesterday, that are linked with using some of those social media data, CDR data, satellite images, to quite often track migrant movements and flows and trends. Though I think we as IOM are not, of course, opposed to using these big data sources. There's definitely quite a lot of considerations that needs to be taken. It needs to be well framed. It needs to be well thought and come also with a fairly clear use of the data that is being analyzed. We published a couple of papers in the last year, one on ethical use of or reuse of private data sources, and one more recently actually with some of your contributions actually on harnessing data innovation for policy, for migration policy. Happy to share those. I think it's quite useful in looking at some of the safeguards that needs to be put in place. And I think one link to that is also related, that's my second point, related to the use of this model, like specifically how are these models and how is this work being used in the field practically. We need, I think, to reflect quite a lot on this, and I think it needs to remain focused and targeted to supporting safe, orderly, and human migration. Listening to the current and the past presentations, I think, yeah, there's a bit of a need to sometimes focus a bit more on the why, and on how do we expect basically this work to benefit migrants and to benefit positive programming and positive narrative around migration. Last week, we were talking very much about in prediction analysis and in forecasting, how can we start looking more into opportunities than risks, into opportunities rather than drivers. So I think it goes with a bit of this narrative that comes with migration quite often. And I think it's always easy to say as an external here. It's of course much more complicated when you're in. But yes, I felt like this is something that should be raised. And then finally on focus, I think fully understanding the focus on Europe, given the funding of these researches. We ourselves are projectized, so I think we understand that. But there's also value in looking beyond a little bit Europe borders. Thanks, I think, for that presentation on Somalia. There is this value in looking outside of European borders. I think you guys presented actually on the coverage of like the ICT coverage, and it's true that now when you're looking at West and Central Africa, coverage of like ICT is quite enormous. So I think there is opportunities more and more to look into using big data for questions a bit outside of Europe. And this is, I think, in the end, what we are looking at in especially in the UN. I think there's a lot of data in Europe. There's much fewer information sometimes on migration flows in West and Central Africa, for instance. How can we apply some of those big data models and sources that you're working on into this type of environment. Like maybe I think looking in Europe is sometimes playing it a bit safe with big data. I think it would be very interesting to look into ways of, for example, developing a flow migration data sets. And that's, I think, Jakub is working on it, and there's a bunch of you also working on this, but there is value, yes, in basically going beyond Europe with some of those models and some of these data sets, big data rather, and yeah, implementing that in West and Central Africa, for example. So yes, I think on this, I would leave the floor to speakers. If you want to react, happy to, and otherwise Q&A. Do you want to react first, or?
Yes, so let's give maybe first to react. Yes.
Go ahead. You don't have to.
The microphone, please use the microphone that is on the table.
So my work was mostly based on European data, so I think I will skip.
Albert?
Yes, so one thing that we were discussing also with Dimitra in the coffee break was once we do these big data projects, and we had this with the Data for Refugees project, at the end of the project, we wanted to see what is the impact we have had on the Syrians, right? After like 1 year after the project ended, what was our net impact? And we didn't have any methods to really measure, because you create these, results or policy recommendations, but then it's very difficult to see how many people pick up on this, who reads your output. Is it the correct people who read your output? And then there's a bigger question. Are we truly influencing the governments when improving the data we serve them? Or are they going to cherry pick the data that serves their purposes and then use our authority to whitewash the whole thing? And that I'm very dubious about, right? I don't think there is a very strong incentive in the government side to, I don't see a lot of need for all the accuracy that we try to put into the data, because in the end, I think the political agendas are shaped by other things. But our potential way out was that the data that we generate can actually empower other authorities. It can, empower researchers to speak with authority. It can empower NGOs to speak with authority, and then their voices can be heard with more trust in the public to regulate what the governments are doing, especially in countries like Turkey, where the government is at the moment, let me not go in there, but we see, for example, in the earthquake that eminent scientists all of a sudden start receiving a lot of trust capital by the public, and their voices are heard because they have been warning about this since 10 years, 15 years, and the government is not taking action. It's taking the exact opposite action, offering amnesties to buildings and not doing proper checks. So can we actually use it? Can we use the outputs that we produce to support the civil society to kind of balance the governments, is my question.
And Jakub, would you like to comment?
Yes, it's a very good point, Damien, and I think the availability of the new data in many parts of the world can be actually at the moment already much better than the availability of traditional data. Part of the thing, that there is a temptation to think that in the same way as mobile telephony enabled some countries to bypass the landline stage, right, and develop communications infrastructure completely differently, that the same may happen to data. I think there is some mileage in this argument, although I still think that there is a need to complement that with more traditional data sources, because we do understand them better. I can't say we understand them perfectly. You've seen from the data evaluation that they're far from perfect, but at least we have a better grasp of what the data are meaning to represent. Whereas for the new data, we are still sort of very much, in the exploratory phase. I think that that's probably the state of the art now. It may well change a decade from now. It may well change as time goes by and as technology matures and develops. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that we need to understand what the data are telling us, and this keeps to be a recurring thread of this discussion.
Just a quick comment on Damien's point. I agree with Jakub and with Damien that I think there is a need for the use of this data. So as a research community, I think we need to be explicit. We should study that, because if we don't know the caveats and we don't know the limitations of this data, and if somebody such as governments wants to use them, they may use to feed their own agenda. There's always a risk that they will use whatever our outputs are to feed their own agenda, but at least we can support or not that, so we can be vocal about it. If we don't know, then we cannot do anything. Another point is that indeed there's a need for supplementing these new forms of data with more traditional data, because we indeed understand them better. For example, surveys, they are run in say in Africa, and you can complement that. We can get this more information about people, or even, and another aspect of that is not only survey but also qualitative research. So how are this mobile phone used? And for example, there was research on Venezuelan migration, and one of the aspects was that we find that many people who migrated, who ran away from Venezuela to Colombia, but the issue was that there was one phone per household. And now, is it one person, or how many people are in the household? Or sometimes they share with friends and family and extended family. So that's one of the caveats, and that's which you can only grasp when you go and see the people and you see the other end of the data that you mentioned. And another aspect is that this new data, or the new approaches may be adopted. It's sometimes a very lengthy process. I think just in the UK, acknowledging uncertainty in migration estimates has been, I don't know how many years, probably Anne remembers better how many years that was an issue. And finally, they produced this uncertainty in the estimates, but then they had to change the system entirely because of the COVID and complete inadequacy of the International Passenger Survey to measure international migration. And that was just one event, a COVID pandemic, that made the survey impossible. So that may also be a triggering point for some of these countries that don't have the proper systems, migration data collection systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vaida. So your complimentary comments turned my question more into a comment than a question, because my experience, so you rightly mentioned about the complications in the traditional data, and it requires time, energy, effort, and countries that they have the means, they already have relatively better data, and countries that they don't have the means, they are not planning to, at least in many countries. So the alternative which was brought in is the big data, and you just mentioned the big data is in a very exploratory stages, and my experience with the National Statistical Institution shows that some of the countries that they have better data, they are not very much interested in big data, and those countries that they don't have data, they are interested, and there is no role model for them. There is no very clear explanation of how to extract data, how to use the data, and what is that was also the question in the last migration statistics meeting in Santiago, that a lot of countries are raising questions. And from what I believe, what complicates things is regulations and ethics, because there is no clear indication of how we could use that data and how data could be extracted. And I think that goes back to the international organizations, that they should deal with that problems. And we know from HumMingBird project that there is a lot of examples how you can, for example, use big data for extracting numbers or data. But then it's always the question, because I know many countries, including Belgium, Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark, they started using big data for statistics, but then they were afraid that they will be sued or they would be having legal problems, then they stopped the project. So I think in order to open up, we need to resolve these small problems which are on the way for extracting big data, to have some examples of that. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, thank you. And just a couple of comments and maybe a proposal for everyone in this room. We keep saying that these data are innovative data, but they're there since I think 12 years now. So they're just alternative data in the sense that this data exists and lots of people in this room actually use this data. And I also do not agree very much that we don't know much about this data. And the problem is that we try to reverse engineer the way they are constructed. So the proposal which I'm making and the impact that we can have as a community of academics talking to politicians or say policymakers is, why don't we, because we know all the pitfalls of this data, why don't we came up with a framework about asking what type of statistics should we get from telco data? So asking the telco company to provide data in a way that we can use for research. And the same is for social media data and for any other type of data. So this framework is something that methodologically we can set up from the technical, say, statistical point of view, technological point of view, but also say from the privacy point of view, the legal point of view. This is something we can do as a community. And this is the impact we can have on society. That's my comment.
Thank you. And one more.
Thank you. I have a lot of sympathy with what's just been said. I wanted to say something about the 2007 regulation and the reason why you saw a change. And it didn't just happen between 2007 and 2009. It had taken 17 years to get to that point of preparation with data producers, suppliers, people processing data in all the member states, as well as outside the then European community, then the EU. And the big problem that isn't really ever addressed is that everybody talks about data and everybody talks about migration or migrant. Everybody's talking about something different. Data isn't just one category that covers everything that is collected. So I think we need, in setting out a framework, to say what kind of information is needed in order to understand migration and mobility, to have precision and conceptual clarity about what is being requested, and an understanding of the cost of working on data, because it's very time intensive. Even if you're looking at big data, it takes a lot of work and thought and expertise to work through what is the meaning of this information in front of me. So I think the kind of holy grail of big data has been used in a shorthand way to say, well, we can ignore all these problems that have taken decades to sort out, but we can't. I think we need to say that traditional data sources can do this sort of job. They can use, say, the 12-month definition, but actually that's been revised in the UN working groups now. So there'll be the Statistical Commission is going to announce new definitions to use. So be on top of all of those changes, to be aware of the need to read all the health warnings and of all of these costs, but also to just be this plea for a bit of humility again, to say big data are not going to answer all the questions, but they could be useful for some aspects of the study of human mobility. And that's about it, really. And it's not necessarily measuring migration. You're measuring where people are at any one point who are using mobile phones or whatever to contact people in another country. Because of transnationalism, we don't know that all of those people are necessarily the people who just travel from one country to the next one. We don't know the backstory of all of that. So just to keep acknowledging that it's a lot more complex than policymakers would like us to think it was. Thanks.
Yes, and we have last round of feedback then, or comments and reflections from the project.
Yeah, in terms of the...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jakub had the hand raised,
Sure.
So welcome, Jakub.
Thank you, Anne. I couldn't agree more. I think what we need to remember is that similarly as the traditional data are social and political constructs of the dominating discourses at the time, focusing on specific aspects, as you alluded to in the opening remarks today. The big data, novel data, or not so novel data, are commercial constructs by and large, and they are again collected for other purposes than measuring migration. And they are just repurposed by us to do some things that we hope will get us some insights into mobility. So yes, there is an argument that either we repurpose administrative data or we repurpose commercial data, and we just need to know how to do it. I think that there is still a longer history of dealing with administrative and other official data that gives us a bit of an advantage in terms of understanding compared to the novel or not so novel sources of data that we're looking at now. Thanks.
Albert?
In terms of creating frameworks for establishing the data exchange between private companies and the governments, it's very difficult so this will obviously create a lot of extra cost for the companies, and depending on the size of the company, for example, a larger telco might store the data for a shorter amount of time because it becomes costly to store it. There are some countries which already have these kind of agreements in place. For example, in Israel, the possibility of attacks with civilian casualties justifies the government to some extent to get the mobile telco data directly from the telco. So they are by law permitted to do that. They can access the data. In most other countries, they can't. But again, the analysis here is as an analysis of harms and benefits. So how much more power do you want to give an authoritarian government if you enable a private company, and then you start maybe small, you create a nice framework which is protected, but will the government stop there and will not demand more? That, I think, is a risk. And it's about control. It's when you make available the satellite data, for example, Ingmar was talking about that yesterday. Now, 2 years ago, there's a deep learning model that now can predict the number of cars from a satellite image. 5 years ago, we didn't have that technology. So I don't know what we will have in 5 years. What will be enabled to process this kind of data? So what I need to do is I need to limit the usage of data. So I need to tell the people, okay, here you can look at this data. In 6 months, you have to destroy it. This, I think.
Then Dilek and Eric.
Do you wanna?
We have to wrap up. We are 20 minutes late.
Okay. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of traditional data sources. Don't get me wrong, I really like working with social media data, and Eric and we worked on using Facebook data and tried making inferences from Twitter data in the past. But maybe it's difficult to put pressure on social media companies or other companies that own the data. But what we have is also traditional data sources we don't have access to. For example, countries have registers, they have censuses that are not necessarily always available to researchers. I think that's also, maybe we can discuss how the academics can put pressure on making the microdata accessible to academics. For example, in Austria, we recently have the microdata center. Now we can have a look at the migrants and their trajectories within Austria, which was not possible in the past. So this is.
I was going to add a very quick point that sometimes it's not only combination of the data sources, but the combination of the methods of collection. So for example, hard to reach populations, migrants. There are examples of collecting data through Facebook and distributing the service through Facebook, which is indeed working well because you can target this specific population. Of course, you have to count on the response rate, but then with properly incentivize, you can reach that population. So combining traditional methods of collecting data, such as surveys, and using those channels through social media or mobile phone, then that might be also a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have to move on, unfortunately. I know that we would like to discuss it further, but the next session, and actually since we've been, yes, big applause to you.